The Progressive Era, 1900 to 1917. Chapter 21. An English visitor to the United States back in 1900 wrote back to his family saying, "Life in the United States is one perpetual whirl of telephones, telegrams, phonographs, electric bells and motors and lifts and automatic instruments." Well, in all honesty, it wasn't quite as automated as the visitor described, but conditions were better than they had been a few years before. Farms and factories were once again prosperous, and in 1901, for the first time in decades, the economy had reached full capacity. Farm prices rose almost 50% between 1900 and 1910, and unemployment has dropped. A Boston newspaper printed in 1904 that in the United States of today, everyone is middle class. Well, the resort to force and the wild talk of the gay 90s are over. Everyone is very busily, happily getting ahead. Of course, everyone wasn't in the middle class, nor was everyone busy getting ahead. There's still some wild talk, because a lot of the problems that had angered people in the 1890s, they're continuing into the new century, and millions of Americans still suffer from poverty and disease. Racism is very heavy in the South, and there is increasing hostility against all immigrants, whether they're from Southern or Eastern Europe, Mexico or Asia. It doesn't matter where they're from. If they're not WASP, we don't want them. But in some degree, the Boston newspaper was right. Economic conditions were better for many people, and as a result, prosperity became one of the keys to understanding the era and the nature of the progressive reform. The start of a new century was another key as well. And it began as you're coming into the new century, you want to take a look at yourselves, much as when we came into the 21st century, the big scare coming into 2000, didn't know what was going to happen. Well, they had much the same thing going from the 19th to the 20th century. They were excited. People believed all this new technology and enterprise, it was going to take shape a better life, and savoring the word new. Oh my goodness. They talked about new poetry, new cinema, new history, new democracy, new women, new art, new immigrations, new morality, new cities. And even the magazines picked up the word, and there was a new republic and a new statesman. And President Theodore Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson called their political programs the new nationalism and the new freedoms. But along with the word new, you've got another word, mass. And that kept creeping up. And visitors in the recent war with Spain, which we'll discuss next lesson, many Americans took pride in the teeming cities, of course, and the new corporations, and they were our marks of the mass society. And they enjoyed the fruits of the mass production. They read mass circulation newspapers and magazines, and they took mass transit from the growing spiral of the suburbs into the city, or the center of the cities. But behind these mass productions and new magazines, there were significant changes in our nation's industrial system. Businesses are growing at a rapid rate, but they were large in the 3 decades after the Civil War. But in the years between 1895 and 1915, they became mammoth, and employing thousands of workers and equipment with assembly lines to turn out huge numbers of the company's product. And inevitably, changes in the management attitude, changes in business organization, changes in the workers' roles, and it's going to influence our entire society. Inevitably, too, the growth of these giant businesses give rise to a widespread fear of the trust, and a desire among a lot of progressive reformers to break them up or regulate them at least. So in the late 1890s and into the early 20th century, a lot of Americans are examining this pace of change and what's it doing to us. And they began to apply the same energy that they had harnessed using natural forces to solve problems before. And they began to call themselves progressives. Now, the turn of the century had a lot of inadequacies and inequalities. And the extreme, of course, was evident in the very, very wealthy and the very, very poor. And they weren't visited on the middle classes. But the people in the middle class and lower class, they had little rise in income with the cost of living, and it's been increasing steadily. And many of them were blaming the trusts, but the opinion growing that the political solutions were needed to solve our nation's problems. And the result was a broad-based reform movement that would become almost a national phenomenon. A revolution in thought. No more are we going to have this laissez-faire government. No more are we going to let social Darwinism be applied to businesses. We got new ideas, and we got new ideas in capitalism and economic competition. And in literature and academics, the former stress on abstract ideas and theories was beginning to be replaced by reality and empiricism. They'd be followed by proposals for action by sociologists, and even lawyers are beginning to challenge this laissez-faire constitutional interpretation. So combining optimism, idealism, and hard-headed, edged practicality, they begin to pave the way for new reforms. Now, all these ideas did not originate with the upper educated elite. In all honesty, the movement began in the churches with the clergy. And it didn't matter whether they were Jewish or Catholic or Muslim or whatever, they began in the churches. Everybody had their place. And of course, it also began to involve middle-class women. Now, the term muckrakers is strictly meaning writers who are exposing the evils of society, which we'll get more into in just a little bit. But they expose things like child labor and race relations and things wrong in the U.S. Senate. But this movement for reform is going to touch everybody. And as many Americans are from diverse backgrounds, as we are today, we're all calling ourselves progressives. But they're going to try to reform whatever evil catches their eye. There's no one major problem that everybody's going to work on. But the one thing they did have in common is they espoused cooperation. They wanted to form organizations to improve society. And that just kind of became the impulse at the turn of the century. But doctors and historians, for example, began to form professional organizations. Of course, the muckrakers had helped that in the last decade, too. And church-related organizations began to emerge, like an interdenominational Federal Council of Churches of Christ of America. And believe it or not, they're focusing on labor reforms. In a lot of instances, the leaders of the organized forces were white, upper-class women, the kind who didn't have to work. Because, I'll take, for instance, a man who's got a job. And at the time, you want everybody to know how successful you are. So the first thing you do is build you a new house. Well, then you get to looking at this house, and that house is absolutely gorgeous, but then your next door neighbors see your wife scrubbing the floors. Well, you can't have that. So you hire a maid to help your wife clean the house. And then you hire someone else to take care of the children. And before you know it, the wife has nothing to do but sit around and look pretty. And she can't get a job, but it's just not done. It would be detrimental to her husband's career. People would look down on her husband for having his wife work. It was just something that an upper-class lady did not do. So what's she going to do with herself? She gets involved in churches. She gets involved in women's clubs and begins to get involved in the reform movement. But these women, they're going to concentrate on issues of morality in the family. And of course, it's going to include prohibition and prostitution. And reformist women became a little bit more aggressive in the late 1890s and began to think about not only just reform, but what causes all this poverty. Something called the National Consumers League began to lobby for better working and living conditions for the child labor laws and give better conditions for women in the working place. Some organizations began to focus on reforming the city government. They wanted to improve housing conditions because we had no rules and regulations. And these shotgun houses that were built, I mean, they were really bad. You didn't have running water. You didn't have electricity. It was just better than living on the streets. Not much better, but a little bit. They wanted to provide some protection for pension plans. Then there was something called settlement houses. In the settlement houses, they offered education and help basically for the immigrant poor. And we'll talk about the Hull House very shortly. But the bad thing was that all this work that women are doing is kind of detracting from the suffrage movement. Social justice. That's what we're striving for. And of course, they're going to seek improvements in race relations. But race relations are going to hell in a handbasket in the South with all the disenfranchisement and everything else. And The South says, there is no problem. And if you don't admit there's a problem, you can't solve it. It's just like if you're an alcoholic or a drug addicted person, until you have admitted to yourself that there is a problem, no matter what's said or done, it's not going to be healed. But they did try to seek improvement in race relations. Blacks realized some of the efforts, but they couldn't take full advantage of them. Booker T. Washington won. He disavowed any accommodations that they were doing. There began to be a move for, we got to do something to help them in the South. And there was this big race riot in 1908 in Springfield, Illinois. And it was kind of the catalyst for spurring people to get together. And a lot of them were white social workers, wealthy women and men from the North. And they invited all these educated African Americans, and they met, and they formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But as I got up here, the leadership was predominantly white and very heavily Jewish American. But there was a few educated, successful African Americans like W.E.B. Du Bois, and he wound up being the editor of their newspaper or their magazine called The Crisis. And they thought, giving him a position where he couldn't do much damage, but he took it and he launched it into a propaganda platform that you would not believe. The man was too smart to be put down too long. And just FYI, the NAACP didn't have a black president until 1975. But as I said, they began to organize. They're attracting members from all members in all classes. But most of the reformers were found in big cities because that's where the biggest problems were. The problems that were on the farm were more weather-related than anything else. But most urban reformers had 4 basic goals. And all immigrants, why did they reject help? Primarily because it's the way my mother did it, it's the way my grandmother did it, and I don't like you, a foreigner, telling me what to do just because I'm in your land. And even though they would try to help them, improve how to cook, improve how to take care of their children, true social reform is when you can educate someone to make changes on their own and improve their lives. But a lot of your immigrants wanted no part of it. But most of your city reformers or urban reformers had 4 basic goals. They wanted direct democracy. They wanted economic regulations. They wanted an increase in the state's services. They wanted social control. They want the city and the state to do these things. Now, it's always going to be the local concerns that are going to guide the reformers. Like I said, there was no one major problem everybody was going for. But even the Boy Scouts got in on it, and the National Collegiate Athletic Association got in on it. Now, I've given you some answers. In the West, they wanted utilities and railroad regulations. In your industrial states, they want workers' compensation. They want some help for workers' compensation, but the conditions that men and women are working in. In all the states, they wanted women and children to be taken care of and have shorter working hours. They wanted to provide pensions to widows, and they were talking about education beyond grade school. And the South announces that segregation is a success. Whoa. It begins to be evident, doesn't it, that a lot of the problems we have are going to require federal action. Is that going to be beyond social reform? We go into the area of social control. Think about that for a minute. My mother used to say that there's always 2 sides to a coin. And on social justice is one side of the coin, and social reform is the other side. But one of the most prominent reform movements was the settlement houses. Now, these people were going to provide services to the poor. And this is a picture of Jane Addams, and this is a very glorified picture of Hull House in Chicago. Now, these 2 pictures, the one on the left is actually, it's supposed to be doing a singing lesson or music lesson. And if you look closely, you can see that they're all immigrants. You've got Chinese and everything else in there. The one on the right, they're teaching the young girls a skill so they can work when they get out of Hull House. But Jane Addams was upper middle class lady. She'd had a very, very sheltered life. And when she was visiting some property she'd invested in after she got out of college, she was horrified at the poverty and the way things were going, so she just withdrew her investment. I said, that's the way to go, just get out of it. But back in the day, young people, there used to be something called a grand tour. The grand tour was what you did when you got out of college to, well, sow your wild oats if you were a man. If you're a woman, go to libraries and museums and operas and things to kind of, well, it's your last fling before you settle down and start having a family and children. So Jane is going on the grand tour. When she gets there, like I said, she'd already become aware of poverty, but she was really stunned by what she saw when she got there. Young girls selling matches on the corner and apples, and it was just horrible. And once she saw all this human misery, as she wrote, she decided upon a career of philanthropy. And she went to visit a place called Tonabee Hall, which was the first one ever started anywhere in the world. It was started in the East End of London, where they had a very large Jewish and immigrant population. Very, very poverty-ridden area for crime. It's kind of like some of our immigrant areas in the States. But the education there was considered to be a success, and there was a debate whether they should move on to other areas, but its goals were similar to those later espoused by Adams, and she got great ideas. And these are the three main ones. You're going to provide some education and recreation for your people. And once you've got them educated and recreated, you're going to conduct inquiries into their living conditions, why and how. And once you find out what's going on, you're going to develop a plan to promote their welfare. It's true reform. You're going to educate them so they can improve themselves. It sounds like a plan. And it works in a lot of cases. But the Muckrakers were totally responsible for the beginnings of a lot of reform movements, and articles written by magazines, brought it to the attention of the public, and they would demand something be done. And it was Roosevelt who gave them their name, and the irony is he's a little bit afraid of them. Some of the articles came about and caused good reforms. In the one instance I've given you is Upton Sinclair in his book, The Jungle. It exposed the unsanitary, horrible conditions in the meat packing industry, because sometimes you would open a can of meat and there'd be pieces of animals and other things in it that you don't want to discuss. But the Muckrakers wore that badge, title of Muckraker, as a badge of pride. Do we have any Muckrakers in today's society? Well, there was Ralph Nader back in 1965 who did the big expose on the automobile industry, and then, of course, you had Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in the 70s about Watergate. Today, we don't call them muckrakers, we call them investigative reporters. But the federal government is trying to, well, cut back on the influence of the traditional power brokers and party hacks, and trying to give, the laborers and the women and children a little bit of power. And they passed legislation, usually at the behest of the Muckrakers. But women's suffrage, for example, became national law only in 1920. Oh, I did mention the lead of progressive states it's not wet, it's supposed to be west. Oregon, Wisconsin, Colorado, a lot of your western states were much more progressive than anybody else. But the women's suffrage movement, it became law in 1920 with ratification of the 19th Amendment. Now, the last amendment we talked about was the 15th, which gave the African American the right to vote. So let's go back and pick up the 16th. Gave Congress the power to collect income tax instead of waiting until the end of the year and you have to pay it. Now, we can do it as we go along. The 17th Amendment, we finally, after many decades, got direct election of our senators, because prior to this time, we elected our representatives and they would appoint the senators. The 18th Amendment, well, it's the one you've had stories about in movies, and all of a sudden a little-known government official's name's on everybody's lips, called Elliot Ness. And we start seeing actually new expressions like T-man and G-man and bootlegger. And you're right, it was Prohibition. And what is Prohibition? It's really nothing more than an effort to legalize morality, right? Women can vote in 1920, but they'd been able to vote in Wyoming in 1869 and in Colorado also in 1869. These are some of the western progressive states. In 1902, Maryland passes a wonderful workman's compensation law, and 6 years later, the federal government does. 1905, Wisconsin established the State Railroad Regulatory Commission, and the next year, the federal government does. It seemed like the states are pushing the federal government. but something called the Oregon and Wisconsin areas. Oregon and Wisconsin are the two most progressive states, and the irony is they're not that close together. But the Oregon system was simply a voter referendum. They also passed workers' compensation laws, anti-corruption laws, good pension laws. They had vocational training statewide, and they established the first kindergarten ever in the United States. You do realize that kindergarten is a German word, right? Meaning children's school. Wisconsin and the Wisconsin idea. We still use this today, actually. It's an idea they came up with. They're going to gather academics and put them together in a little group, and they're going to ask their opinion on, and they're supposed to be nonpartisan. I may be Democratic or Republican, but this academic, he's just been educated in the field, so he can give me some nonpartisan ideas. And sometimes they call them brain trusts. Now, I think Reagan was Chicago, University of Chicago is who he used, I think, if I'm remembering right. Yeah, it was Reagan. Yeah, FDR's also did the same thing. I don't remember what college he used, though. But most of Oregon's reforms were adopted by Wisconsin. And a man called Lafayette, supposed to be L.A., not L.O., was elected governor 3 times, and he was United States Senator from 1906 to 1925. Now, he was quite the dude. He was a professional politician. He even ran for president one time and took 70% of the vote, but he lost to another presidential candidate. But don't go thinking that Wisconsin must be the place chock full of educated, altruistic working people and a great place to live. And they were not the only reform-minded and Republican, but they did elect the nation's first socialist senator. And, of course, Joseph McCarthy, the red baiting junior senator from Wisconsin who caused so much problem in the early 1950s. He's from there. He accused everyone from the janitors at the White House to the military generals and everyone else of being a communist. My oldest son's been there a couple of times, and he said that it's a nice place, good people. He says, but they got mosquitoes down there. They're biggest horses in Texas. He compared them to flying vampire bats. I've never been to Wisconsin. I've been told, from what I've heard and seen, that Kentucky has more actual mileage of waterways than Wisconsin does. But anyway, progressivism begins at the local level. If they can't get that done, they go to the state level. If that doesn't work, then they go to the national level. And it also causes changes abroad. For instance, we had 3 progressive presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, which we'll get more into later. The opinions differed, but Roosevelt was, well, they said big stick diplomacy. Carry big stick, speak softly is an old African proverb, and Teddy Roosevelt liked to use the military of the United States to speak softly with big stick. It's like sending the White Fleet around the world on a goodwill mission. Well, when you have a bunch of warships steam into your port, you sometimes wonder how goodwill it is. President Taft, he just liked to throw money at stuff. And Wilson had to use missionary diplomacy. He was one of the most religious presidents we've had, which we get into him again there, again, another chapter. So they call him big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, and missionary diplomacy. But they were reform presidents. And like I said, we get more into them a little bit later on. So exactly who were the losers and winners in the reform movement? Well, direct democracy did increase the power of urban political machines, so it's good and bad. It's one of those double-edged swords. But in a way, it made government just a little bit more honest. They did manage to get utility rates lowered. And the biggest winners were the large corporations, what we call the middle-class technocrats and the special interest groups. White, urban, Protestant, and middle class, yeah. But the urban ethnic groups were losers, and the small businesses were losers. And, of course, African Americans were the biggest losers. Just a little bit more. Progressivism, the people who were in it, they were acting out of a genuine concern for the bad effects of only industrialization. And they were very optimistic about human nature. And they were more willing than ever to get involved in other people's lives. They prefer to use voluntary ways they want to educate you and let you change your own life, but that doesn't work. We have no qualms about using state or federal governments to force you to do it. A lot of them were drawing on the evangelical and Protestantism to justify their desire to purge the world of evils. But they were organized, and they like to solve problems, and they begin toward the end of the movement to attract a lot more educated group of men and women. They were interested in social justice. They didn't just want to give you money. They wanted to teach you how to fish. What's that old expression? I can give you a fish to eat, but if I teach you how to fish, you can feed yourself. And something called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, very powerful organization because we've got all these upper-class women that don't have jobs, and we've got maids and babysitters at home. They've got nothing to do, and they get involved. And by 1911, there was more than 250,000 female members. And they managed to push, in 1916, just 5 years later, they managed to get 19 states to pass laws banning alcohol. Then all of a sudden, the 18th Amendment, which was going to not only ban the manufacture, but the transport, selling, or consumption of alcohol. And now it's no longer a social reform. Now it's social control, because you've gone from trying to educate people to passing a law to make it, you have to obey. Also, another social control was 1910, that Mann Act was passed. And the Mann Act, well, it's named because of the man who proposed the plan was named Mann, not because it's a Mann Act. It bans interstate transportation of women for immoral purposes. In other words, if you live in Owensboro and you want to go over to Indiana and have a little hanky-panky, well, depending on who finds you, it could be immoral and you could be arrested for violating the Mann Act. Or if you're 19, she's 18 or 17, below the age of consent, they not only get you on the Mann Act, they get you for statutory rape, so you got to be careful. No longer social reform, social control. Now, this isn't just a white movement. There is a National Association of Colored Women. Oh my goodness, I should have done more than spell check, folks. And it was begun in 1895. They established kindergartens, they established day nurseries, they established playgrounds and retirement homes. You see, we've got a growing population of middle-class African Americans that have got their own businesses, they get money, and they're part of, I guess, what you would call, Nixon would call the great silent majority. You don't see them, but they're there. Then there's a National American Women's Suffrage Association under the tutelage of Carrie Chapman Catt. Sometimes they got a little belligerent. But the American Women's Suffrage Association, the two of them had always been at odds. The National Association wanted to get a federal law passed for women to vote. The American Women's Association wanted to get a state law. But they eventually merged in 1890, and things are going to go better, and they're going to get kind of prissy sometimes. Did you ever stop and think what women went through to get us to vote? I mean, these suffragettes, when they would be arrested, they would be put in jail and starved, just given bread and water, and when they got so weak they couldn't eat, they'd force feed them, or they'd take all their clothes off and chain them to a bed in an insane asylum. They're just horrible things to the women who were trying to do nothing more than seek the right to vote. And once they changed their minds from excuse me, instead of demanding to vote as a right to vote, we kind of put our little velvet gloves on and said, well, it's not a natural right so much as we're more sensitive to moral issues than the men are. And if we can use our vote to help improve society and give the man a break and to think more important things like wars and things like that, and we'll take care of, like school board things and, use our femininity a little bit, which is what we didn't want to do, but it got the point across. But the social justice movement did have the most success in, shall we say, passing state laws that limited the working hours of women, and also, not only did they limit the number of hours, but in Wisconsin and Oregon and even Kansas, they said different hours for different types of work, and telling a woman, like when you're going to go to work in a factory on the line, they insist that you've got to lift 100 pounds or something, and they said that women can't do that. And now it's called discrimination. And a lot of your women's movements were mad about that law. They thought that is discrimination. If a woman thinks she can lift 100 pounds, let her go for it. But by 1913, 39 different states had the maximum hours. Of course, like I said, Wisconsin, Oregon, and Kansas are the ones leading the roll. And child labor law was passed in 1916, but the Supreme Court, in their infinite wisdom, overturned it, and it wouldn't be till 1930 that a court-supported national child labor law was passed. And the reason given behind it was that the government had no right to tell you what to do with your family. If you want your kid to work, you should be allowed to work. But a very dramatic shift began, and the new ideas are starting to focus more on the environment. Just because your dad was bad and your mom was bad means you're going to be bad. No, now it's the environment you're raised in. And they're beginning to accept it more all the time, and they're calling for, good treatment. So this new decade, a new doctrine called Pragmatism emerged. And it simply means that the practical approach to problems and affairs. I mean, don't keep banging your head against the wall trying the same old thing again and again. If it's not working, do something different. And a man named William James, a brilliant Harvard psychologist, very warm, tolerant person, but very impatient with the theories that made truth an abstract and stagnant thing. People, James thought, they're shaped by their environment, and they shape their environment. He wrote a book called Pragmatism, and became so popular it had many editions. The tough-minded accepted change. It's kind of like the Alcoholics Anonymous prayer, give me the patience to make changes and the patience to also know the things that can't be changed. Gather your facts and discard ideas that don't work and act on those that do. But the most influential educator of the progressive era was John Dewey, and he applied pragmatism to educational reform. He stressed the children's needs and capabilities, and he described his beliefs in a number of books, and the most notable, The School and Society and Democracy and Education. And in it, he opposes rote memorization. He opposes dogmatic authoritarian teaching methods. And he emphasizes personal growth, free inquiry, and creativity. And I take homage to that. I had a child who was having difficulty reading many, many years ago when we were in California. So they take him out of the school, the room he's in, and they put him into special education. And they start teaching him how to read with words that are spelled like they sound, like cats, K-A-T. Well, it didn't take but a few months, and the kid's reading great. But then when they tried to bring him back to the normal C-A-T, he didn't want any part of it, and he has fought it his entire life. And he was even worse off after with this creativity nonsense. And I also had a teacher tell me once that there must be something wrong with my daughter because everything she painted was in purple. And purple is a depressing color. It just happened to be her favorite color. The girl is a school teacher today, and she even has purple in her bathroom. I mean, she loves the color purple. So this creativity thing that they're going for, got my problems about it. But they're starting to reject the old view of law as universal, the lawyers are, and they're viewing it as a reflection of the environment. It should be an instrument for social change, which I agree. For instance, in Denver, Colorado, I don't have this on this, it's just, I want to ask you to remember, it's just a little FYI. A judge by the name of Ben Lindsay sentenced a young boy to reform school for stealing coal. And the boy's mother rushed toward her, just grief-stricken, and banging her head against the judge's podium. And the judge was really surprised. He investigated and discovered that the father of this child was a smelting worker. And he was dying of lead poisoning. He was at the point where now he couldn't get out of bed. His family needed coal for heat. And his mother couldn't work because she had to take care of him, and the boy was too young, so he'd stolen a bucket of coal to heat the bedroom of his dying father. And the judge got to think, this isn't right. This is not a hardened criminal. It's not genetic. It's environment, and you got to do something. So he starts sentencing the youthful offenders to get a good education. He worked for playgrounds and slum clearance and public baths and technical schools. He became known as a kid's judge, and he started sentencing children. I'm like, this boy shouldn't have been sent to a reform school. I mean, maybe sent to a school to get education, but he can't steal stuff and get away with it. But he's not a hardened criminal. He did it to help his dad, who's dying. It's like when we had that hurricane in New Orleans. I had sympathy for the people who were going to grocery stores and getting diapers and food for their kids, but no sympathy for somebody that went into a Cadillac dealership and got a Cadillac. I never did understand that one. And this kid's judge started attracting visitors from as far away as Japan. They wanted to study his methods. And so it's good. Reject some of the old views of teaching, the personal touch, creativity. I can see it's one of those, again, double-edged swords. There's good to it and bad to it. I don't think it should be a universal thing. I think it should be, every case should be on its own merits. That's why I have good with so many question marks. Inner Socialism with Eugene V. Debs, who we met the last two chapters. Originally president of the American Railroad Union, and while he was in prison, he saw the light, and when he came out, he formed the Democratic Socialist Party. And this man is so opposite of anything we would have thought. He wasn't the wild-eyed, hair-standing-up radical. He was very reflective. He was very gentle. He had a great speaking voice. And he was not a good organizer. He was a good platform speaker, passionate. But even though he could captivate his audiences, he attacking the injustices, he just couldn't seem to pull the party together. So just what kind of people joined the Socialist Party? Well, the intellectuals, because while pointy-headed intellectuals are always curious about what someone else is doing. The factory workers who aren't earning much money. The disillusioned populists from out west. Tenant farmers who didn't have a pot or a window. The miners and lumberjacks. And within 10 years, by 1911, there were even socialist mayors in 32 different cities, including, surprise, surprise, Berkeley, California, Butte, Montana, and Flint, Michigan. Yeah. And it was even getting support in rural Texas and Missouri and Arkansas. In Oklahoma, it actually attracted as much as 1/3 of the vote. But most socialists who want progressive reform rather than threatening to overthrow the capitalism like the communist workers of the world unite, we're going to overthrow capitalism. No, we're going to promise to make things better for you. So with all this, the federal power is increasing. The federal government began to believe that they should be the agent in reform, that it was their job to help improve America. And the progressives are believing more and more in the ability of experts, and thousands and thousands of commissions and agencies take form, and they're staffed by trained experts. And the strangest thing is we've had such great voter turnout up to this point, and now we're starting to have, it's falling, because people are beginning to use interest group to achieve goals. I mean, why go to the polls and go to all this trouble listening to politicians when we can go to this interest group? Sounds good. Now I want to tell you just a little bit about Margaret Sanger. Feminism is probably a word that you're not throwing around too much today, but it was a word that began to be used in the progressive era. And when a question was asked in a New York meeting in 1914, what is feminism? Actually, this club was part of a new Bohemian club, a social circle of artists and stuff that was in and around the Harlem area. But Margaret Sanger, you've heard so much pro and con, and with Margaret Sanger, it's a great deal like the Bible. A lot of things that she's been accused of saying, she actually said, but when they're taken totally out of context of why she said them, it sounds bad. It's like some of the ministers in some of our churches, they'll go into the Bible, and they'll go into this chapter and to find one significant little sentence in a chapter that's got, 15 or 20 different verses, and take it out and interpret it the way they want to interpret it. That's not right. You cannot interpret one segment. You've got to look at the whole picture. Otherwise, you're missing the point. But anyway, Margaret Sanger. She was born in November 14th, 1879, Corning, New York, the one of 11 children born to an Irish worker. Her mother had even had several miscarriages, having 11 children. And her father was very unusual. Even though he was Roman Catholic and he was Irish, he believed in education for his girls, so she was educated. But Margaret came to equate large families and miscarriages with poverty. And her dad, even though he was a wonderful man, he really preferred to drink and talk politics and earn a steady wage, so they were always broke. But she managed to come up with enough money to go to a local college, and she went on to study nursing in a hospital. And in 1902, she married a man named William Sanger, who was an architect, and the couple eventually had 3 children together. Well, she hadn't been married about 8 years, and they moved to New York City and lived in the area close to Greenwich Village. Now, Greenwich Village was a bohemian area at the time, known as a place for radical politics, and the couple became very immersed in that, and they socialized with the likes of Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, and arch feminist Emma Goldman, whose name you heard, who you will hear when you watch the YouTube on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She joined the Women's Committee of the New York Socialist Party and the Liberal Club, and she participated in strikes. She went on whatever she could do. But one day when she was working as a visiting nurse in and around the area, she was sitting with a woman who had a miscarriage. No, she hadn't had a miscarriage. She had an abortion. And it had been botched, and the girl was bleeding to death. And there was nothing she could do because the uterus had been punctured. And Margaret's sitting there watching, and back alley abortions. And this woman had 6 children, and she'd gone to the doctor, and she'd asked the doctor what could she do to prevent having another child. And the doctor's advice was, have your husband sit on the roof. Well, that wasn't going to work. She got pregnant, so she proceeded to try to abort herself with a knitting needle and punctured her uterus, and she was dying. Margaret, this is unnecessary. Women should know more about their bodies. Number one, she should have been able to not have a child and not have to make her husband sleep on the roof. There's got to be a magic pill or something you can do. And then she started a feminist publication about the same year called The Women's Rebel, which promoted a woman's right to have birth control information and to talk about their body and learn about it, because so many of these women didn't have any idea about their bodies. They didn't know how to be clean, how to be careful, they just didn't know. Because of this Comstock Act that had been passed back in 1873, it prohibited any kind of publication or mails or anything else of obscene and immoral materials, and they considered anything dealing with the human body, especially the female human body, as obscene. So even doctors were not even allowed to give you information. And of course, any publication, and it didn't take very long till she was arrested for printing this obscene and immoral material in a magazine. It was aimed at women, written for women by a woman, and rather than face a possible 5-year sentence, she went to England. And while she was there, she worked with the women's movement and began to research all different types of birth control, including the diaphragm, which she later smuggled back in the United States. And by the way, she'd separated from her husband by this time, and the two later did divorce. And she began to embrace the idea of free love. But that's another story. It's been said she had an affair with H.G. Wells. I don't know. That's just gossip. But anyway, she came to the idea that she began coining the phrase birth control. But this was not a public political argument. This should be a private argument between a woman and her doctor. The government shouldn't have any part of it. She came back to the station in a couple of years, and charges had been dropped against her. And she began touring around the States to promote birth control, like I said, a term that she herself had coined. And in 1916, she even opened the first birth control clinic. It was her and her sister, and they were arrested. The clinic was closed 9 days after it opened, and they were charged with providing information on contraception and fitting women for diaphragms. And Sanger and her sister actually spent 30 days in jail for breaking the Comstock law, later appealing her conviction. She did score a little bit of a victory for the birth control movement because the court wouldn't overturn the earlier verdict, but it made an exception to the existing law to begin to allow doctors to prescribe contraception to their female patients for medical reasons. And about this time, she also published her first issue of the Birth Control Review. In 1921, she established the American Birth Control League, a precursor of today's Planned Parenthood Federation. She served as president for a couple of years, and she opened her first legal birth control clinic in the United States in 1923. The clinic was named Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau. And about this time, she married her second husband, and he was going to end up providing a lot of the funding for her social reforms. But wanting really to advance her cause through legal channels, she started the National Committee on Federal Legislation for Birth Control in 1929. And it tried awful hard to get things done. One legal hurdle was overcome in 1936 when the United Court of Appeals allowed for birth control devices and related materials to be imported into this country. But she's not without controversy. She's been accused of being an advocate of sterilization, of euthanasia, of of everything you can think of. Did she say more children for the fit, less for the unfit? Yes, she did. Now stop and think about it. If a woman has a baby every 10 or 11 months, she's not going to be very healthy. She's going to be pretty weak from all this babying. If she has one every 2 or 3 years, she's going to make herself healthy again and be able to take better care of her children. If the mother's healthy and can take care of the children are going to be healthier and better off for it. That's what she was trying to say, that if you're healthy and you can take care of your kids, have as many as you want. But don't just keep bagging them out every 9 or 10 months because that's the way you're supposed to go. But she did have some views that were common at the time and that now seem a little bit strange. She did support sterilization of the mentally ill and the mentally impaired. And I am of that same opinion, because if you have someone who is mentally challenged or who has the brain of a 3-year-old and the body of an 18-year-old, you've got potential problems. She doesn't know the difference between playing doctor and actually having something done to her. No, I don't believe in forceful sterilization. And I don't believe in sterilization to prevent, change the race. But for protection for my child who's 18 and doesn't know how to say no or wouldn't know what no was, I get in a lot of trouble with that. I'm not for mass sterilization, but I think that there are instances when it should be taken into consideration. She established the International Planned Parenthood Federation in 1952, still looking for a magic pill. She finally was talking to a man called Gregory Pincus, who was a human reproduction expert to work on the problem. She got the necessary support from someone else in an international harvester heiress, as a matter of fact. And the research project would yield the first oral contraceptive. It was approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 1960. So I know it seemed like a long time ago to you young people, but when I was your age, we didn't have any types of birth control other than natural types. The pill didn't come along until the 1960s. But she did live to see another important reproductive rights milestone in 65, when the Supreme Court made birth control legal for married couples. But she died a year later in a nursing home in Tucson, Arizona. And across the nation today, there are numerous women's health clinics that carry on Sanger's name. She was not promoting abortion in any way, shape, or form, but these back alley abortions, and I will admit that they go on some places today. I don't think abortion is the right birth control method. There's too many other things out there. I mean, you've got not only just diaphragms, you've got pills you can take, you've got things you can inject in your body, in your arm, and sometimes you don't have to do it once a year. I mean, anyway, I always get in trouble in this area. I'm very sorry. Now, I'm open up with our progressive president's next lesson and get into the age of imperialism. I think your text covers it a little bit in this chapter, but I'm not going to get into it right now. I'm going to stop and let you go do your thing, and thank you for listening.